First question always is whether this is working. Can you hear me way back there? Okay? Yeah, good. Second, if don't feel restrained. If you'd like to speak up in the course of these informal remarks, don't hesitate. It's kind of a lot of people, but it would be better if we could treat it as a seminar, interactive. So please just speak up if you'd like. Ask questions, make comments, produce refutations, whatever it may be. Okay. Well, I'll start with a couple of general comments. Very briefly, as Hisa said, the field is roughly 60 years old. There have been enormous changes over this period, but a few things have remained fairly pretty constant. One is the recognition that at the core of language, there must be some generative procedure, recursive compositional procedure. The second is that the field ought to be, I think, framed within a biological context. So we're interested in what's come to be called I language, internal, individual language viewed intentionally. We care about the actual system of rules, not just some class of objects it might enumerate. Those two stands, I think, have remained constant, but many changes in implementation and development. Well, it follows from this that the main thrust of theoretical work, apart from the minimal condition of trying to achieve some kind of descriptive adequacy for the variety of languages, the main thrust of theoretical work would be to simplify UG, and partly, in the first place, because that's just normal scientific practice, so you do it in every field. Try to eliminate stipulations, achieve deeper explanations by reducing complexity and so on. That's just the nature of science, so that's one reason. And because of the biological context, there's another reason here, and that is in the background is a concern to try to show how this biological system could have originated, what's misleadingly called evolution of language. Of course, it's misleading. Languages don't evolve, but the language capacity, UG, does evolve, or must have evolved. It's around. So one thing, the more stipulations and complexity, and the richer the assumptions about the nature of UG, the harder it's going to be, obviously, to try to account for how the system might have originated. So that's a separate reason, apart from normal scientific practice, to seek the simplest possible system. Well, we can, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, envision enough progress was made, I think, over the 60 years, so that maybe 20 years ago it was possible to envision with relative clarity what the optimal system would look like, the ideal to which we might strive. The optimal system would conform to what's been called the strong minimalist hypothesis. It's not precise, but some aspects of it can be made reasonably clear. One element of it would be that the combinatorial operation, the generative operation, should be as simple as possible. Now, there is a simplest possible combinatorial operation. It's found in every generative system, any recursive system. It's the operation that's come to be called merge, basically set formation in its simplest form. Notice that, as you know, merge has two special cases, external and internal, and there are no copy operations and no operation of remerge, contrary to what's often claimed. Just plain merge, the simplest possible combinatorial operation, in effect, set formation. So that should be, the optimal system will have that alone as the combinatorial operation, I think, further step is necessary if there's time we go into it, but at least that. And beyond that, if it's optimal, it just should refer to what have sometimes been called third factor properties, general laws of nature. In the case of a computational system, that would mean laws of computational complexity. These are, again, not totally clear by any means, but some things are pretty obvious, like less is better than more, or less search is better than more search, things like that. And from a very few simple assumptions about minimizing complexity, you can draw a fair number of conclusions. Well, the best system then would be one that meets just these conditions. Merge is the operation. Beyond that, minimal computation. In the talk I gave the other day, if some of you were there, I tried to show how this ideal system, and of course, the system is interesting if you can get significant results out of it. So what I tried to show the other day is that by just rough sketch, but you all know the details, so I won't go into it, by just assuming nothing but this, merge and minimal computation, you can derive some pretty surprising conclusions. One of them is that the output of the generative system yields the proper forms for semantic interpretation in quite complex structures. I gave simple ones, but it generalizes to quite complex ones. That means that what's generated is essentially a language of thought. Maybe, I suspect probably, the only language of thought. It kind of creates a system of thought. One conclusion. The second conclusion is that externalization in one or another sensory modality, usually speech, but could be sign or something else, externalization is just an ancillary process. It's not part of the core of language. Its properties do not enter into from these assumptions, do not enter into syntax and semantics, the core systems of language. Rather, they're reflexes of the sensory motor system. And the nature of the externalization depends on which sensory motor system you're using. So the kinds of organization and arrangement that you have in sound are different from the ones that you have in sign, and would be different from ones used in some other modality, which is also possible. Touch, for example. That's the second conclusion. The third, and of course this is quite a hard task to relate the internal system, which is just based on, which satisfies, presumption is the strong minimalist thesis, to relate this to the sensory motor system is a very hard cognitive task. Can be satisfied. The sensory motor system is not specifically adapted to language. It was apparently around hundreds of thousands of years before language suddenly emerged. And there are many ways to map one to the other. And it's a hard process. And in fact, that's what we find is that the complexity of language, what you have to learn when you learn a language, is almost entirely externalization. And it varies a lot because there are many ways to do it. Of course, there are principles. It's not just arbitrary. There are principles of phonology and morphology, which are non-trivial, but they have many possible implementations. And it's also susceptible to easy variation. So it changes all the time. And that's basically what we're all familiar with. A third conclusion is that most of the doctrines about the nature of language in the related fields, in linguistics, philosophy of language, cognitive science, most of them are just flat wrong. There's a doctrine which is held virtually at the level of dogma, that the way it's put is the function of language is communication. It's a kind of a curious notion because biological systems don't have functions. They do all sorts of things. like the spine, for example. What's the function of the spine? Hold the body up, preserve the nerves, produce white blood cells, all kinds of things. There's no particular function. But the dogma is that language, uniquely among biological systems, has a function, and the function is communication. But if these first two conclusions are correct, that has to be false, because communication is based on externalization, and if externalization is an ancillary property of language, then communication is even more so. This really is dogma. If you look at the related fields, it's simply taken for granted that it just has to be true, but apparently it's false if these arguments are correct. So that's another significant conclusion. It's extremely hard to get anyone in the fields to even contemplate it because it's so contrary to standard assumptions of recent years, not if you go back far enough. It also follows from this that virtually all the work that's done on what's called evolution of language is on the wrong track. It's almost entirely speculations about evolution of communication. And whatever one thinks of those speculations, they're not going to tell you anything about language. So that, if this is correct, that literature can be essentially dismissed. And the final conclusion that comes from this is that you do get explanations for some non-trivial properties of language. The one I talked about is the long-standing puzzle of structure dependence of rules, which is actually a very surprising property of language. If you look at it, it means that from the point of view of production and perception, parsing, language is systematically ignoring the simplest computational operations and is using much more complex ones. And that should puzzle people. It hasn't puzzled them enough, but was recognized to be a puzzle 50 years ago. Lots of efforts to deal with it, but it in fact would follow automatically if the strong minimalist thesis is correct. That's basically what I talked about the other day. Well, you can decide to what extent you think that's convincing, but to me it looks convincing, and I'll assume it here. If so, the major problem of linguistics, the driving issue in theoretical linguistics, ought to be to ask to what extent other aspects of language can be brought within the same set of assumptions. So what else can conform to the ideal? And ideally, we should try to show that everything can. I take it, at least from my point of view, that seems to me the nature of the field. The field should be an effort to try to determine to what extent every aspect of language is either ancillary, like externalization, or else falls under the strong minimalist thesis, including, crucially, syntax and semantics, what's called semantics. Actually, I should say that what's called semantics is actually syntax. It's symbol manipulation, a symbol manipulation of the kind that may have some significance about the outside world, just as phonology has some significance about sound. But nobody confuses phonology with sound, and we shouldn't confuse, say, model theoretic semantics with semantics. It would become semantics only if it's related to mind external objects, and it makes no effort to do that. So in fact, all of this is syntax in the technical sense, some of it oriented towards meaning and truth and inference, some of it oriented towards noises, but it's all syntax as long as it's in the head, as long as it's just computation. But crucially, the parts that are called syntax and semantics, they ideally ought to fall within the strong minimalist thesis. I think that's the goal we'd like to achieve. And what I'd like to do now is just pursue the question a little bit beyond and see if we can incorporate other aspects of language in the same framework. I'm going to use here examples of Hisa's and comments of his, which I don't know if other people have seen them, but if you circulate it? No, okay, this is just private between the two of us, and I'll modify some of these as I go along. I'd like to assume a fairly recent paper, the paper Problems of Projection, which I understand that a number of you are familiar with, so I'll kind of take that for granted. If you look back, this introduces some changes in the way the basic questions have been looked at by me and others. If you go back to, say, 50 years ago, there were a number of properties of language which were immediately taken to be subject to inquiry, have to be understood. One of them is composition, phrases, bigger phrases, and so on. Second is order. Things appear in a linear order. Third is projection. Phrases are of a certain type. So the early rules would be, VP, arrow, VNP, and so on. VP is the projection. Fourth was displacement. We understand phrases in positions other than where we hear them. These were the basic notions. The way it was divided up, division of labor in the early work, was that composition, projection, and order were part of phrase structure grammar. Displacement was part of transformational grammar. And over the years, most theoretical work has been an effort to try to simplify these two components of the system. So phrase structure grammar by the 1960s was simplified to X-bar theory, which eliminated a lot of rich stipulations. Unnoticed was the fact that X-bar theory actually introduced a new stipulation. It introduced the requirement of endocentricity. So X-bar theory forces endocentricity. I think that was a mistake. I think, in fact, there are very clear examples of non-endocentricity. In fact, every case of internal merge the output is non-endocentric. There have been efforts to get around that, but I think they're a mistake. And probably the same is true just of subject-predicate. You go back to the syntactic structures and so on. The first rule was SRONP-VP, the traditional rule that sentences consist of subjects and predicates, and that's, of course, exocentric. And I think that's probably correct. The endocentric hypothesis forced a great deal of complexity and arbitrary decisions. But that was a consequence of the simplification of phrase structure grammar to X-bar theory. Well, over the years, it went on, finally leading to a bare phrase structure, but it still maintained the endocentric stipulation. With regard to transformational grammar, that went through various stages, ultimately reached Lasnik and Saito's theory of move alpha. That was what was going on for roughly 40, 50 years. The way it looks now, to me at least, is different. Order, I think, is out. As I said, that's just part of externalization, so that's not one of the properties that we have to deal with. Composition and displacement fall within merge. So they fall within the simplest combinatorial operation. And stress again, contrary to a lot of technical work that's coming out right now, there is no notion of copy. There's no notion of remerge, just merge, period. That leaves a projection. And projection is different from the others. The other three notions, composition, order, and displacement, are transparent. You virtually see them. They're right in the data. Projection, on the other hand, is a theory internal notion. You don't see it in the data. And I think it doesn't belong in the whole system. I think it's rather it's the result of a principle of minimal computation, a principle that tries to identify the nature of a syntactic object by minimal search. It's probably a third factor principle. Just there is an empirical assumption here. The empirical assumption is that at the level of conceptual intentional interface, the thought interface, it's necessary to know what kind of a unit a particular syntactic object is. So we'll interpret verb phrases differently from noun phrases, differently from clauses, and so on. So there has to be some procedure of identification. And optimally, it should be minimal search, finding the most prominent element. And that assumption is sufficient, again, to yield a couple of crucial consequences. One of them, it turns out, it follows at once from this that internal merge, what was called move, has two possibilities only. One is that it's successive cyclic, which is a good consequence because it is successive cyclic. A second is that the successive cyclic operations stop when the generation reaches what Luigi Rizzi called a criterial position, a certain type of position. And then it stops there. It can't go on. That's what Rizzi called the halting problem. You keep going successive cyclically, you're forced to go successive cyclically, you can't stop, and you have to get to a criterial position, then you must stop. These are observed features of internal merge, and they follow at once if you assume that the only properties are the ones I just mentioned. That's what's discussed in this paper, so I won't review it. The cases of internal merge that are significant for this are basically two types. One, indirect questions, embedded WH phrases. We have to look into the nature of those. And the second is subjects in subject-predicate constructions. And subjects have a number of curious properties which have always been mysterious. I'd like to talk about them. One is the property EPP, the extended projection principle. So why do things move into subject position altogether? If we accept as looks plausible the predicate internal subject hypothesis, which looks reasonable, why do you ever satisfy EPP? Or why must you satisfy EPP? That's one open problem involving subjects. And another one is the empty category principle, ECP. Why in certain structures is extraction from subject blocked, though in the same structures extraction from object is perfectly free? I suspect that these two properties are the same property. They correlate in striking ways. So if we take two major types of language, English-type languages, which have overt expletives, and Italian-type languages, which have null subjects, the two major categories of language. It's striking that in the English-type languages, they have to satisfy both EPP and ECP. The Italian-type languages don't satisfy either of them. And this is true over quite a broad range. And it strongly suggests that these should be reduced to the same property. Maybe that's why they've looked so mysterious. They've been studied in quite different ways. Anyway, I'll try to pursue that suggestion. I should say, incidentally, that there's something a little misleading in just the history of the field. By accident, the first language that was studied in any depth was English. And other languages that were studied were kind of investigated on the model of English. And that's probably a serious error. English looks like an outlier. It's a very unusual type of language in these regards. If you look at the languages of the world, the languages that have overt expletives are pretty rare. And where they do have overt expletives, there's something weird about them. Always, every case I know. So in English, the overt expletive is an adverb, why. I mean, it's a vaguely locational notion, but you really have to use rich metaphors to make it locational. Like, there are reasons for expecting it to snow tomorrow. There's no location. You take a look at, say, German. It's just an invented phrase. Es gibt has nothing to do with anything. Icelandic, it's a determiner. In French, it's il y a. Again, nothing to do with anything. Furthermore, these invented expletives actually have contradictory properties. So if you take something like il y a in French, it has to agree with an associate, but the expletive is singular and the associate can be plural, and the verb connected with the expletive is singular, it should be plural. So you actually get contradictions from the expletives. In Hebrew, the expletive is just some made-up word, has nothing to do with anything. Yesh, no structure, no nothing. Same in Arabic. And every case I know, and there aren't a lot of cases, the expletive is a strange unit. So to take this as the model for language is probably a bad mistake. In the Italian-type languages, the null-subject languages, it's always been assumed that there's a null expletive. But as far as I can see, the only reason for assuming that is that in English there's an overt expletive. And that's obviously not a good reason. Probably there is no null expletive. It's just that EPP isn't satisfied in these languages, period. And strikingly, ECP isn't satisfied either. That interesting work by Luigi Rizzi on that years ago. And that seems to be quite general. So I think that suggests that we should look for a common origin to ECP and EPP. We should regard the English-type languages as having some kind of extra, superficial extra property with, for some reason, they stick something into the expletive position and we'll want to ask why. Well, that's what I'd like to try to look at. I'm also going to assume strict cyclicity in the version that I'll assume here is phase theory. It's a particular version of the property of strict cyclicity that's been found all over the place, and that has a kind of obvious computational motivation. It's a much more economical computation if you can construct a unit and then forget about it, not bother changing it again. Obviously, that reduces computational burden very significantly, and I think that's probably the core driving motive behind the design of language as involving strict cyclicity. Phase theory gives one version of this, and I'll assume the phase internal phase impenetrability condition, PIC, as it was originally formed. So it formulated. So what's transferred, and I'll be concerned here really only with transfer to the CI interface. The other, as I say, is secondary. What's transferred is the interior of the phase. The edge of the phase, meaning the head and whatever may be merged to it, that's not transferred. That's accessible for later computation. Incidentally, in this approach, there is no notion of specifier. That was another mistake, I think, that came from X-bar theory. X-bar theory, because of its endocentric stipulation, had a notion of first merge, second merge, third merge, always merge to a head. And that introduced notions like specifier, second specifier, and third specifier. But all of those are just stipulated. There's no motive for any of them, and I assume I mean, I'll use the notion, but just for expository purposes. It has no meaning, just to refer to that position. So in that, with that proviso, the specifier and the head are at the edge. All specifiers in the head are at the edge. There may be more than one. And they're accessible to later computation, but what's transferred is frozen. You don't have to look back at it anymore. I'll take that as the nature of phase theory. In my own recent work, I did suggest some problems with that. I thought were problems, but I think it was a mistake. So if you take a word like, say, leave in English, the verb L-A-V-E, leave, if you just look at the interior part, leave, NP, it's undetermined whether it's an unaccusative or a transitive, and it'll get a different interpretation, whether it means, suppose you have leave the class. It could come out the class left, okay, unaccusative, or it could come out the teacher left the class, transitive. And if you just look at leave the class, you can't tell. So I assumed incorrectly that in order to determine the interpretation of this phrase that's getting transferred, you had to look and see if there was a subject, okay? If there is a subject, it's going to be transitive. If there isn't a subject, it'll be unaccusative. Now, the subject is inside the phase, but it's outside what's being transferred. So I assumed that in order to transfer, you had to take a look at what's outside of what's being transferred. But that's just a mistake. There's a subject if and only if the head is V star. There's a property of the head which is going to be one-to-one correlated with whether there's a subject. Furthermore, because of inheritance of features, the properties of the head will in fact be inherited by the V that's inside. Okay, so if you look at the V that's inside, you know right away whether this is transitive or unaccusative. So therefore, it's not necessary in cases like these, there are a lot of cases like these, it's not necessary to inspect anything outside of the interior in order to transfer the interior. So that complication, as far as I know, can be eliminated. It was just a mistake of mine. So I will assume that that PIC works straight, no complications. Well, let's proceed further with Hisa's examples, and I guess it would help if I use, I don't know how good your imaginations are, but let me use the blackboard. I think it'll probably be easier. So I can get this to work. So take his first example, the boy. What do I want? And then here we have, I don't know, saw the dog. And call this, which do I want? Call this one alpha and call this one beta. And then as many right brackets as you need, okay? How does this work? How do we generate it? Well, first assumption, this is now based on the work of Lasnik and Saito, actually derived from suggestions of Masa Koizumi going back to Paul Postal years ago about raising to object. The first assumption, which is an interesting one, is that this goes over here. Okay, and you know the arguments for that. It's a the case where this is significant is ECM, exceptional case marking. So if you have the sentence, John expected Bill to come, is Bill in the higher clause or the lower clause? I mean, semantically, it's in the lower clause. But it turns out that for a lot of properties, it acts as if it's in the upper clause. That was Postal's original observation. Lasnik and Saito have a version of it in contemporary terms. And I think that's correct. I think they have, personally I resisted it for a long time, tried to find ways around it, but I think it's correct. So that means the dog is really over here. I'll drop the article. And here, this is, of course, it just means the same thing. It's a copy, but I won't write the copy. You're familiar with that. Well, how does that work? First of all, what gets transferred? Well, we want beta to be transferred. The phase, this whole thing is a phase, but this is the edge, so that's not going to get transferred. But beta ought to get transferred. And by the basic assumption, it'll be transferred only if everything's labeled. If something is not labeled, it can't be transferred because it'll crash. There won't be any way to interpret it. So the crucial question is beta labeled? There's, of course, this. The way I assume it works is that V star has features like signs, accusative case, and so on. And in some languages, visibly, there's agreement with the object. I assume there is in all languages, but it's not always visible. So the features of this go down to this thing. Dog has features. This is an XP-YP structure, the kind that's not allowed by X-bar theory, but that clearly exists. And the assumption in the paper that I'm assuming here is that if the two XP and YP have the same most prominent feature, okay, then that serves as the label. The search procedure, minimal search, will just find the same thing in both XP and YP, so it'll label it by essentially the phi features. Okay, so beta is labeled by phi features. So that's okay, it can get transferred. Now there's an interesting question that arises about the raising to object. Elastic and Saito give some evidence that indicates that it's optional. There's other evidence that indicates that it's obligatory. So if you take a sentence like, take ECM, John expected him to leave, condition B applies obligatorily. And according to the whole framework of the discussion, it shouldn't if it's optional, because the conditions for an AFR are supposed to be basically clause-bound. Okay. But it looks obligatory, and I'll assume that it's obligatory. That raises a question. What about the cases that they gave where it doesn't seem to be obligatory? So that's a homework assignment. Show that there's something wrong with those cases. But let's take it to be obligatory, which I think it probably is. Then that raises the question why it's obligatory. Okay. One possible answer to why it's obligatory, which I suspect is correct, is that saw is not actually a verb, but that it's a root. I'm now going to be assuming the approach to lexical items that's developed and discussed by Alec Morantz, but discussed in enormous detail, 3 thick volumes by Hagit Borer, quite interesting work. It basically assumes that every language is essentially proto-Semitic, has roots and inflections that determine what the category of the root is. It may not be accidental that Hebrew is Hagit's native language, but the tendency to make your own language the universal one. But I think this is pretty good evidence for this. You can look at it and decide. So suppose what we have here is really a root, and the reason we're interpreting it as a verb is because this thing is a verb. Okay, so that means that the roots get their categorical character by the inflectional element that identifies them. Okay, that incidentally cuts out a redundancy, namely the redundancy between small v and big V. If this was small n, then this would be an n, so we eliminate that redundancy. If that's correct, then it's plausible that roots are simply not candidates for labeling. They don't have any properties. They don't have enough properties. So roots are not candidates for labeling. Let's assume that. And I think there's good reason for that, even if you just look at head-to-head constructions. I'll discuss it a little bit in that paper. So if roots aren't candidates for labeling, then raising is forced. Otherwise, this thing can never be labeled, right? So that forces raising, which seems to be the case, and it'll give this as being labeled by the shared features of XP and YP. Notice that the same argument will carry over to raising to subject, okay? And that's what I think we should be looking for, some similarity between the various operations that take place. So take EPP, okay? EPP is going to end up with a DP, let's call it, and a T. It's an XP-YP phrase. X-bar theoretic approaches have not permitted it to be viewed as XP-YP. Arbitrarily, it was regarded as a TP with the DP, the specifier of TP, but that's perfectly arbitrary. You could have just regarded TP as the specifier of D. The theory tells you nothing. The opposite was picked because it's correct, but not because there was any evidence for it. Okay, so we want to throw that out. It's not an endocentric construction. And the question, EPP, the EPP problem is why this has to be here. Okay? Why, say, in English, unaccusative? Notice that the issue arises specifically for unaccusatives or passives, something where there's no, nothing internally driving the subject to raise. So why in English don't you have sentences like why aren't there normally sentences like there arrived a man? Notice that there are such sentences, but they have a very peculiar properties. You can't say, who did there arrive, let's say, or anything. You can't relativize it. And the reason, I think, is that a man is actually adjoined. It's underlyingly there, but it raises. And in fact, you see that in sentences where you put more structure in, like, there arrived last night 3 men from Germany. You can't say there arrived 3 men from Germany last night. It has to be off at the edge. And it doesn't raise and so on. So actually there are no sentences like the Italian unaccusatives, it appears. And when you don't have that, the question is why there has to be inserted. Why doesn't it come out like Italian, where you can just have arrived a man? That's perfectly normal. Nothing wrong with it. As I mentioned before, in Italian linguistics, it's generally assumed, universally assumed, that there's an empty pro there. But I think that's just because it's modeled on English. The natural assumption is there's nothing there. It doesn't satisfy EPP. There's plainly a parametric difference between English and Italian. English is a type. Italian is a type. It's not these particular languages. What's the parametric difference? It's usually been related to richness of inflection. It does seem to correlate very closely with richness of inflection. Well, let's pursue that intuition and take a look at T. In the English type languages, T probably has no features at all. It's the features that it has depends on the context that it's in. So if T is in a CT construction, it's going to have the feature tense and have 5 features. If there is no C, if it's an infinitive, it'll have essentially no features. Okay, so T itself is basically featureless. It's just a position which has to be there for a variety of reasons. But it's let's call it weak. That makes it like R. It would be the kind of element that can't function as a label. Okay, it's too weak in English. And notice that requires exactly as in this case, it requires that raising be obligatory, or else that something be there, so that you can get the XP, YP type labeling. Well, the two things that can happen are either the subject raises or you get an expletive. The expletive is some arbitrary element, which I presume is just there so you can get the shared features and label the subject-predicate construction. What about Italian? Well, in Italian, the T is rich, so it does have the property that it can serve as a label, so you don't have to raise and you don't need an expletive. Okay, now that would distinguish the Italian and the English type, and it would be similar to this with one difference. The difference is that in both the English and the Italian type, you do have to have raising to object, because R is always weak. It's not parameterized. T is parameterized, R isn't, okay? R just universally is not a possible label. T in itself is not a possible label, but if it's enriched by inflection intrinsically, then it can be. I think that gives part of the story as to why English type and Italian type languages differ with regard to the inflection, but not with regard to the raising to object. Okay, that's the beginning of that. Okay, let's proceed on with this. Suppose we extend this, and we have, I'm still following Hisa's. Yeah, we extend this by adding some C here. Let's say that to start with. I'll change it to others. And here we have another element, let's call it gamma, which will include T and then alpha, that one up there, okay? Well, we know what has to happen. This position has to be filled either by an expletive or by raising of the subject. Let's take that case. The raising of the subject is formally the same as the raising to the object, okay? But it's different in that it's parameterized. For English, it has to happen just like object. For Italian, it can, but doesn't, because the T is already rich enough. That means that for the English type, EPP is obligatory, and gamma here gets transferred because it's all labeled. The connection between these two is the shared most prominent element, essentially the phi features, and that's the label. So gamma is fine. We can interpret that. Before going on with this, let me move over here and take a slightly closer look at the property of head movement that's involved. Okay, notice that both of these involve head movement cases. The root is raised in the lower case, and the V goes to T in some languages, French, not English, in the other case. So let's look at that. What's all that about? Well, head movement has been problematic for a long time. There's conflicting evidence as to whether head movement is syntactic or phonological. Okay, it looks syntactic because it's successive cyclic. So, for example, here the root will go to V star, and ultimately it'll go to T, and then it can even go on to C. Okay, and each time the assumption is it's joined to the next highest head, but that's successive cyclic movement, and that can't take place in the externalization, right? It has to be syntactic. So there have been many attempts to try to interpret head movement as an externalization property, but this is the basic reason why they they run into trouble. It has this essentially syntactic property. On the other hand, there's strong evidence that it's phonological, that it doesn't feed the CI interface. The strongest evidence is it has no semantic content. A movement and a bar movement always have very significant semantic content. That's duality of semantics, basically, which looks like a deep linguistic property. But head movement never does. So you go back to, say, Jean-Yves Pollock's original arguments about this, distinguishing French from English. French and English verbs are interpreted exactly the same way, though the French ones are raising to T and the English ones are not. And furthermore, internal to French, if the verb raises to T or stays behind, say because an auxiliary raised to T, they still have the same interpretation. So the head move, and quite generally, head movement is not doing anything semantically, which must mean that it shouldn't be feeding the CI interface. And that's been the problem about head movement for a long time. There's other related problems, but this looks like a straight contradiction. Well, how could we resolve it? Remember that all, I don't even know if I'll need this, all operations are taking place at the phase level, right? Except for external merge, because you have to construct the phase in the first place. But apart from external merge, all operations are at the phase level. That includes internal merge, and it includes transfer. However, notice that there are various orders in which these operations could apply at the phase level. So, for example, one possible order is that transfer could apply before raising applies. I think that's probably what's happening with head movement. The transfer is proceeding before the raising of the head, so you have no semantic effect of the raising. The raising then takes place, which puts the head at the edge position, so it can be picked up by the next phase. That gives you the syntactic property. Okay, if that's the way, that's one of the options that's automatically available if all operations take place at the phase level. So let's, and that would resolve the contradiction, right? So I suspect that that's what's going on. So let's assume that's head movement. If correct, it solves that set of problems. Okay, let's go on beyond. Suppose that instead of the dog, we had which dog? I'll just write it this way. Okay. The boy saw which dog? It's going to come out as a question or maybe a relative, depending on how it ends up. Same as before, this is going to have to raise to here, but now it's going to have to raise to here, okay, because it's going successive cyclically. So let's put something else in here. We have the, oh, I'm sorry, wrong. Well, here we have boy. This is the V star phase. And the which is going to appear here, and keeping to, he says, notations, which you don't have, but it makes it easier for me. That's lambda, okay? Maybe you can circulate your notes, it'll help. So we have to look at this thing. This is a V star P, right? It has the WH phrase moving to the edge on its way to where it'll end up. Boy is just the external argument. It's stayed in place, and the rest is the same. What happens here? Well, now, this thing is still alpha. We keep that the way it was. I could have changed it. But alpha here has no label, notice. Because it's an XP-YP structure. This is the YP. But these share no feature. Okay. This is the inflectional element that's connected with the object position. And it doesn't tell you anything about the subject. Okay, like you could have object plurality and subject singular and so on. So that means that alpha can't be labeled. Okay, so something has to happen, and we know what has to happen. This has to raise in the next phase. That's EPP. Okay. Once that raises in the next phase, then, because the whole nature of visibility of units that's discussed in the paper, I won't go through it, this thing will simply, alpha will simply be labeled V star. Because its copy essentially makes it invisible for the reasons that are discussed in the paper. It's kind of a discontinuous element, okay? You look at the paper for details. So therefore, EPP will permit alpha to be labeled, and alpha at least will be transferred. On the other hand, what about lambda? Well, that's another XPYP structure, and that's not going to be labeled. So on the next phase, where we're trying to label this thing, we'll get stuck. Well, we know the answer to that one. The WH phrase has to raise. Okay, that will then enable lambda to be labeled at the next phase, and everything can get transferred. Okay, that's the second. That's why this is a case where a WH phrase is raised to the edge of the V star P, but then is compelled to go on to the next phase, which will say be a CP. Okay, could be a V star P, but we'll pretend it's a CP. The same thing if you either way. All right, that takes care of that. Now, suppose we do raise it all the way. Then we get something like which dog. And here we have a C, and then the rest of it, that's after the raising from the V star P. What about that? Well, whether that's labeled or not depends on what the C is. If the C has a Q feature, it's inherently interrogative. That's an inherent property of a clause. If it's inherently interrogative, then the feature will match the interrogative feature of that. There's more to say here, but let's just go into it more if you like. But match the, I should stop. No, okay. Well, just a second. I'll try to finish. Then if this is a Q, these two will match, and that's the criterial position. So it stops. So we have to ask why it stops. We still have the halting problem to deal with. If it's a declarative, then we got the same problem. We have to have successive cyclic movement. Okay, that's that category of things. Now let's take a look at violating freezing. Now, suppose that this is a Q. Sorry that this is getting a little messy, but maybe you can watch it. Suppose this is a Q and we try to raise this farther. So we now get a sentence like, which dog do you wonder, an inherent Q down below, which dog you wonder, will the boy see, something like that. Well, the problem with that's a problem because the internal sentence is a yes or no question. It's now a yes or no question, right? Just has a Q, nothing else. So you're trying to embed a yes or no question inside a WH question, and that's just incoherent. And so it crashes at the interface level by incoherence. Now, that would solve the halting problem for this case. I'll refer you to Hisa's work for what happens in Japanese, which is interestingly different. Okay, maybe he'll like to bring it up. But for the English type languages, the halting problem for this case is solved by the fact that you just get incoherence. You're getting a question, a yes-no question inside a WH question. Can't happen. Next case. Suppose you get a sentence. Take the sentence. which dog, I'll go over these fast because it's getting late. Do you wonder if, say, the boy likes? Here, the which phrase came here, normal way to the V star, and then it came to this position, edge of the CP, and then it went on. And it's okay, but the question we have to ask is, why didn't it stay right here? Okay, it looks like an indirect question. Well, if you take a look at it, you have to ask what if is. Notice that if, the same would be true if instead of if we had, say, why or whether or something like this. And in fact, if is probably in that category. Okay, it's a Q, basically. It's the same category as the WH words. But that means that if we have a WH phrase here, we're going to have an XP, YP structure, which is unlabelable. They have no features in common, right? The thing that is moved successive cyclically has no features in common with the WH phrase that's inside. So therefore it can't stay, and therefore it's going to have to move on. And you get the correct sentence, which dog do you wonder if the boy likes, or which dog do you wonder why the boy likes, or any of those. They all work. Well, that raises the last question. Suppose we tried to raise the subject. Why don't we get which boy do you wonder if likes the dog? Looks exactly parallel, right? Instead of raising, we ought to come out the same way. If we ought to be able to raise the boy, which boy to here, then raise it to the front, and get which boy do you wonder if likes the dog? Well, that's obviously out. That's ECP, right? So why should ECP be blocked? Notice it's blocked for English. It's not blocked for Italian. Okay, that's crucial. Well, we have the answer to that already. If we raise the boy, we're going to be left here with a T, which is too weak to be labeled. Okay, because this is English, remember. It has the weak T. It has to have this here in order to get a label. So this is stuck. That's the halting problem for subject, which gives the ECP. Okay, reduces to the same property that gave the EPP distinction for the English and the Italian type languages. So without going on any further, the EPP and ECP do fall together from this point of view, and the two different types of languages differ as we want. They differ for null subject, but not null object. There are null object languages, but that's different. These two categories are as we like. The object raising is obligatory. The subject raising is obligatory for the English type, not for the Italian type. That's the EPP property. The halting problem holds for the English type, but not the Italian type. That's the ECP property. So again, all of this seems to follow just from the ideal case, the perfect case. Nothing assumed other than minimal merge and minimal computation. Well, that is the, I'll just close there. That's, I think, the ideal towards which theoretical linguists ought to strive, to ask how much can be accommodated with no assumptions. And for reasons I mentioned the other day, this would fit quite well with the very little we know about origin of language. So it's plausible from other directions that this ought to be the right kind of answer. And the task is show that it's true. Because on the surface it doesn't look true, too many problems. But that's the nature of science. Nothing looks like it works on the surface. The idea is to try to show that it does. Okay?
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll have 3 microphones that we can have run around the room. And we have approximately 20 minutes for questions. So questions, comments, discussions, anything from anybody.
Specific to the last illustration of the successive cyclic cases of embedded interrogative, you said that if or whether or something like that interrogative, T is also weak.
Is
T, that
for English type.
For English type, so that the strong T is only for the declarative C.
For the Italian type.
For English cases.
Well, for English, my assumption is that the parametric difference, there is a parametric difference between English type and Italian type. That's the null subject distinction. And I'm suggesting that the parameter resides in the nature of T. For the Italian type, T is richer. That's, in fact, the usual assumption. It's got rich inflection. For the English type, it's weaker. And it therefore is too weak to serve as a label, which means that it has to be enriched, metaphorically speaking, by being paired with something which shares the same phi features. But then if you raise that thing, it's invisible again, so it won't label the lower thing.
So in English, across the board, is T.
Pardon?
In English, across the board, T is weak.
Across the board, it's weak.
That's the assumption.
And that's going to force EPP and force ECP. It unifies the two things. And for Italian, it's rich, so it doesn't have either of them.
I have a related question about the EPP. So that what you mean is that even the Italian, is it the language variation or the kind of construction variation? Because that in Italian case, it's strong. But how about the infinitable T of Italian case?
How about what?
How about the T
ECP?
EPP?
EPP.
Yeah.
Doesn't hold for Italian. Now, it's assumed to hold.
I mean, infinitable.
What?
Infinitables in Italian. Infinitives.
Infinitives in Italian.
In infinitivals. You don't have it.
In Italian.
In Italian.
Do infinitives obey the EPP?
You can have an infinitival without a subject. It's usually assumed to have a subject, but the subject is null. How do we know it's there? My guess is that this assumption about Italian is based on a false analogy to English, just because of a historical accident. English was studied first, so the other languages that were studied kind of picked the English model. But that's a very bad model, because English is extremely unusual. And in fact, most languages just don't have an expletive. You can have a subject, but you don't have to. So the standard Italian sentences just have like verb, subject, or verb, object, subject, something like that. They assume that there's something left in the subject position. So when you have, say, what's called a raising of subject to the right in the Italian linguistics literature, they're assuming that it starts in the subject position, raises to the right, and leaves a trace. But there's no reason for that, other than that's the way English would work. And that's obviously not a reason. So it's probably the case that the Italian type languages just don't have EPP and don't have any null expletives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Two questions. First, so if in English, if T is weak across the board, what happens in the case of ECM infinitival and raising infinitival, where T, has
no
already not
basically no features.
No features, right?
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, even raising the subject into the infinitival,
Just ordinary, like
yeah,
A movement.
yeah. But even if you raise the subject, you can still get labeled, right? Since because T has no features at all there.
It's probably labeled V star. I suspect that it's probably the answer. The T is so weak it just gets absorbed into the T star.
So do you think
It's
there
a good
is...
question, but I think that's probably the answer.
Yeah, and do you think there is a successive cyclic A movement?
Pardon?
Do you think there is successive cyclic A movement?
Well, there is. That's tricky.
Right.
You know, the literature is kind of conflicted on that. The question is whether you get reconstruction in A movement. And it's a pretty complicated story. There's some evidence for it, but it's pretty weak evidence. I mean, the evidence for reconstruction in A movement is things like they seem to her to like Mary, where you seem to get a condition C effect. And on the other hand, if you take, they seemed to Mary to like herself, you can't get it. So condition A is blocked, and condition C works, which would follow if there's something in the embedded subject position. So that's the kind of evidence that suggests you get reconstruction. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that says you don't. Lasnik has some papers on this. Savigny Trito has some questions. They depend on pretty complicated arguments about negation and quantification and how they get interpreted and so on. But I think it's kind of like an open question whether the successive cyclic movement.
Can I have one more? Yeah. And what do you think about the label for topicalization CP?
Well, topicalization is presumably only a root phenomenon.
Yeah, right. Sure.
So you don't really have to label it.
So
I mean, there has to be.
I thought you were claiming that in order to get interpreted, you need label, right?
What?
I think you claimed in problems of projection that you need to have a label in order to get interpreted, right?
Yeah, but you know there are a lot of questions about root sentences. Every approach has to say something special about what's at the root. You know, like Hadge-Ross tried performative analysis, and others have tried other things. But whatever's special about the root, we can just say the label's just root. Now, there are embedded topicalizations, but if you take a look at them, they have the prosodic structure of separate sentences. So they probably are actually embedded root sentences. The crucial case is WH, because that's clearly embedded. Topic and focus look like root phenomena. The topicalization is an interesting case because, you know, in the case, it has to do with this thing which I kind of waved my hands about how you get the Q on the WH phrase. Notice that a WH phrase is basically ambiguous. It could turn out to be a relative. It could turn out to be a WH phrase. If it's Italian, it could just Japanese. It could just be an indefinite pronoun. You know, so it doesn't seem to be marked for one or the other, which suggests that it actually has an unvalued feature, and that feature is determined by what it's related to. If it's related to a Q, that unvalued feature will become Q, and then you get the shared features. If it's a relative, be associated with declarative, will get minus Q, or whatever you call it, right? And if it's just an indefinite, it'll stay an indefinite. What about topical? But now that raises a question about topicalization. Topicalization, it doesn't, any phrase can be, virtually any phrase can be topicalized. It can't be marked by a feature saying I'm a topic, because it can even be a generated phrase. Like you can say, what you like surprised me, where what you like gets topicalized, but it's generated. So there can't be a feature on the phrases that get topicalized that say I'm a topic, which must mean that the operation's free. And that it becomes a topic because of the way it ends up. And maybe because of, you know, Rizzi's left periphery, or maybe just because of something general about the position of roots. But that's why the WH phrases are a little misleading, because they have a property that makes it look as if, you know, in the earlier systems where movement was restricted to agreement, to feature agreement, topicalization never fit, because there's no property to a topic. or focus. Could be anything.
I have a very easy question. I wonder how does agree with T in Italian?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
In Italian, I mean subject and T. How do
subject and T agree in Italian?
What?
How do subject and T agree in Italian?
Just the same as unaccusative. So suppose you have an Italian, an unaccusative, like arrived a man. Okay, a man is nominative, singular. Arrived is going to be singular, and has the same 5 features as a man. That's just a long-distance agreement. Okay.
agreement is another operation?
Long-distance agreement works. I mean, I think that is agreement. The unvalued 5 features of the T relate to the valued features of the associate. The unvalued features of the T get valued, and the structural case feature of the associate gets valued. So if it's a T, it'll get valued nominative. It's a V star, it'll get valued accusative. But that's just long-distance agreement, which you get in English-type languages too, but they're defective in the manner that I said. So you do get things like, there arrived a man, or there was killed a man, but defectively, like they don't undergo WH movement and so on. But that's long-distance agreement. That's the normal case. It doesn't have to move to. I mean, what was called spec-head agreement at one point has a residue in this system, namely sharing features. But there's no spec-head agreement. The agreement's taking place before it gets raised by long-distance agreement. Okay, so if you have a sentence like John saw the man, whatever that was, the boy saw the dog, in the base position for the boy as internal subject, VP internal subject, it agrees with the tense. That's independent of its raising. It agrees with the tense even if it stays there. Okay. Why does it raise? Because of labeling problems.
I'm just curious about the notion of chain uniformity in the case of ECP. Because you suggest that the chains must be uniform, right? A chains must be uniform and A bar chains must be uniform.
Can you repeat it?
I'm sorry.
I'm interested in the notion of chain uniformity.
Chain uniformity, he's talking about.
Chain uniformity.
Chain uniformity.
A chains must be uniform and A bar chains must be uniform.
Yeah, I understand. I don't think we need the notion, as far as I know. There is a notion like chain, if you want. When you raise something, you get 2 copies. And that's basically a discontinuous at the phase level. You can see that that's a discontinuous element. Beyond the phase level, you can't see anything. But at the phase level, you can tell that 2 occurrences are copies. We have to distinguish in any theory between copies and repetitions. Okay, so there's going to be a difference between the sentence, take the sentence, he saw him, or the boy saw the boy. Now, that's a possible sentence if the 2 occurrences of the boy are independent of one another. It can mean that boy saw that boy. And that is, intuitively, that means you draw them from the lexicon separately. On the other hand, if you say the boy was killed, there are also 2 occurrences of the boy, but they're the same. They're not repetitions. They were drawn from the lexicon once. And you can tell that at the phase level. The reason is that it's at the phase level that all operations apply. So at the phase level, you know whether internal merge applied. And therefore, you can tell whether 2 identical elements are copies or repetitions. If internal merge applied.
You were saying in the last case, the which boy case, in the last subject extraction case, the phase head can distinguish the 2 copies, one in spec T and one in spec C.
In the last case that you looked at, which boy case?
Yeah. the head C can distinguish, can tell that.
Let's see what the last case was. Which boy do you wonder if likes the dog?
Yes, that case. And one copy sits in spec C, spec of if, and the other copy sits in spec T.
So you have two
Right.
copies, spec if, spec T.
Spec if and spec T.
Two copies.
Yeah, but that's within a single phase. Well, it's actually, I skipped the V star P phrase. There's a V star P in between. I just skipped that one. But if the WH phrase is first going to go to the spec V star, right? That's inside a phase. You can tell that they're copies. Then the next one is in another phase. You can tell that they're copies. And then we have transitivity of identity. Each successive cyclic movement requires that at every phase you determine whether two identical things are copies. If they're copies, then at the next phase you're going to get copies, and then you have transitivity of identity. It should be formalized, but that's the intuition. I think it works straight. Yeah.
I would like to ask the question about the syntactic object named lambda on the whiteboard.
Yeah.
It's a multiple spec structure. And
So that's the WH phrase on
Yeah.
a V star P.
yeah. And if the labels are determined by minimum search, the label of alpha should be the head of the outer spec, the phrase in the outer spec of little b star, right?
So you're asking about alpha, the V star P, the subject of V star P.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
base position of the subject.
Yeah, but and what I mean to say is, it's what I'm talking about is lambda, which includes
Yeah.
the WH.
Lambda has a WH phrase attached to it. So the question is why you don't get any labeling?
Well, yeah.
Well, you don't get any label. Yeah, I understand.
It seems to me that the label of lambda should be the head of WH.
No, because it's an XP-YP structure.
Yeah,
But when you have an XP-YP structure, the algorithm doesn't know which head to pick.
But the label of WH phrase is closer to.
It depends how complicated the WH phrase is.
But you say.
So, I mean, the other one also has a prominent feature.
But you say.
In fact, the most prominent feature of the other one is V star.
Okay. But I think you say subject and the little b stuff. When you talk about external argument and its sister, you say minimal search is ambiguous. So the minimal search locates D and little b star. So
I understand.
in the same way, if we consider in the same way, the lambda's label should be Q or the
Yeah, I understand.
D.
We have to understand search of XP-YP to always be ambiguous. And notice that how deep it'll be depends on the structure of the phrase. So if it's pictures of which book did you see, it's going to be deep, but it'll still be a WH phrase. So the concept of, you're quite right, the concept of ambiguous search will have to have the property that for XP-YP it's always ambiguous, unless there's a shared feature which is equally prominent. Otherwise it could go either way, depending on the structure of the phrase. Yeah. And we clearly don't want that. Yeah.
Okay, we only have time for one more question at this point. So the last question here.
You are assuming the labeling is determined in the case of head movement after transfer, right? Then do you think you are going to extend that position to the adjunction structure generally? I mean the timing of labeling.
The raising is after transfer.
I mean, suppose we have an adjunction structure of any type.
Let me see if I...
Head movement or XPYP case.
I'm sorry, say it again. Suppose
we have an adjunction structure.
adjunction.
Yeah.
I didn't go into adjunction structures here. That's an interesting question. I said at the beginning that I think merge is not quite rich enough. The reason it's not quite rich enough is because of adjunction structures.
Okay. So suppose we have created or merged and end up with the adjunction structure.
If we have one?
Suppose we moved and we have applied the internal merge to something. Then we have an adjunction structure.
A head movement, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the head movement itself, I think, is adjunction.
Yeah. Then how about the XP case
The what?
of adjunction?
XP case is not adjunction. It's just set merge. That's one of the differences between, that's one of the reasons why why a head movement in the past has been sometimes thought of as phonological. Notice it doesn't meet the extension condition.
Yeah.
Head movement does not meet the extension condition. It's adjoined internally to the unit. And that was one of the arguments for saying it's really phonological.
Okay.
Okay, but I think that property of head movement has to be maintained. So when you join V star to T, it remains a T. It doesn't become a V star. And if it's moving up to C, it's the T that's moving up, not the V star. So the thing that's adjoined is always asymmetrically related to what it adjoins to, and that's pair merge, I think. Kind of like relative clauses or indefinite numbers of adjectives. They're all pair merged. They're not set merged. That's why you can have an indefinite number of them. If you go to the early days of phrase structure grammar, one of the big problems, Howard Lasnik had papers on this and others, is how you can get an indefinitely long coordination. John is tall, happy, angry at his brother, tired of the world, and so on and so forth. It's just unstructured coordination. And it can go on indefinitely and has no hierarchic structure. And that's impossible with phrase structure grammar, right? You can't generate things like that. And I think the answer is that that's not set merge. All of those cases have an asymmetry built into them. The adjective, in traditional grammar, what you say is the adjective is predicated of the verb, of the noun. The adverb's predicated of the verb. But once you've predicated it, it remains what it was. Okay, same with relative clauses. You can stack up relative clauses indefinitely. They have no internal hierarchy. But when you add a relative clause to a noun, it's still a noun. So I think that requires another operation, the next more complicated operation after set merge, which is pair merge, which gives an asymmetry. And that seems to be the way head movement works. It gives you an asymmetry. Okay, so the V that's adjoined to T leaves the unit as a T, kind of the way an adjective adjoined to a noun leaves the unit as a noun. And that doesn't satisfy the extension condition. So it's not, that was, as I said, one of the arguments for saying it's not syntax. And I think it is a kind of a mixture of syntax and externalization, which probably relates to the timing of the transfer and raising operations. Could just reduce to that. But I don't think you can get around the fact that it is always an adjunction operation. I mean, there are attempts to get around it, like Or Chomsky has an article in which he argues that head movement really goes to spec, and then you have some kind of merger operation. But that's just the merger operation is just a way of saying it ends up being a junction. Has no other function. You know?
Okay, I think we're going to stop there. Let's give our speaker another round of applause and thanks.